Thank you everyone for joining us today for this event, Reimagining Care in India, Engaging Men, Advancing Equity. I'm Pranita, and this is my privilege to welcome you all on behalf of the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW Asia. Care is very fundamental to our lives. Our capacity to care for ourselves, for children, partners, friends, communities, and even for the planet is central to human survival and well being. We all recognize somewhere or other that care sustains families, enables societies to function, and underpins economic productivity. Yet, despite its central importance, caregiving in India and globally remains deeply gendered. Women continue to bear a disproportionate share of unpaid care and domestic work. Data from the Time Use Survey 2024 illustrates this clearly. Many of you must be aware or heard of this data, but it's always good to reiterate some of the figures. On average, women spend 289 minutes each day on unpaid domestic work and another 137 minutes on caregiving, compared to 88 minutes and 75 minutes respectively for men. This unequal distribution of care creates what many calls time poverty. It restricts women's opportunities to participate in paid work, pursue education, develop skills, and just the basic that she is not able to fully engage in public life. For decades, feminist scholars and practitioners have argued that care must be recognized, reduced, and redistributed, not only as a matter of social justice, but also as a prerequisite for achieving gender equality and enabling women's economic participation. However, care and conversation around care often focus on the economic value of care. Not that it's not important, but care is more than work. Care is also relational. It involves emotional investment, communication, empathy, and connections within families and communities. These dimensions of care, particularly within spousal and family relationships, are rarely discussed in policy or programmatic frameworks, despite the fact that many of gender equalities are reproduced within these spaces. Deeply embedded social norms shape how caregiving responsibilities are understood and recognized. In many contexts, individuals, and I think it's important to really note that it's not only individuals, but even systems see men primarily as the financial providers, while women nurture and caregivers. Evidence from studies on masculinities in caregiving in India reflects this pattern clearly. In the study on the state of fatherhood study, what we have found that three-fourths of men who participated in the study agreed with the notion that men provide care by earning, while women care for the home and children. Now, this framing not only places a heavy burden on women, it also limits men's opportunity to engage more fully as caregiver and to experience the emotional and relational aspect of the care. But there are also a lot of opportunities for change. What we found in the same study that nearly half of men expressed support for boys learning household care, household skills, and many recognize the importance of spending time caring for their children and partners. The study showed that men recognized and expressed the benefit that they are gaining out of being a caregiver. Um, I won't get into a lot of these data points. These are available. But the thing is that these findings remind us that caregiving is not only beneficial for families, it also strengthens men's own relationship and well-being. um, it also shows that the policies, when available, accessible, and supported, can play a critical role in encouraging men's participation in caregiving and strengthening family bonds. But I think what is really important, that engaging men in care is not simply about asking men to help with the household task. It's about reimagining care as a shared responsibility, challenging rigid gender norms, and creating enabling environments where men women can both participate meaningfully in care for self and others. This is precisely what brings us together today. Today's event aims to reflect on emerging evidence and experiences from programs that have engaged men in caregiving and to explore how these efforts can be strengthened. I'll just quickly take you through the flow of the event. We will begin with a presentation highlighting insights from a review of programs on men's involvement in care. This will be followed by a discussion with experts who will share their reflections and recommendation on how we can move towards more equitable and inclusive care systems. We hope this conversation helps advance thinking on how care can be better recognized, valued, and shared so that caregiving becomes not the invisible responsibility of women alone, but a collective commitment that benefits families, communities, and societies as a whole. Thank you once again for joining us and looking forward to the discussion ahead. Before I step aside, let me invite my colleagues Aniket and Radhika. Quick introduction. Aniket is a dedicated social sector professional with over 6 years of experience in the NGO sector. His main areas of passion has been critically challenging rigid ideas of gender and masculinities, especially in the context of adolescent boys. As a research consultant with ICRW, Aniket continues to build on his skills and feminist perspectives. Radhika is a senior technical specialist, gender and development at ICRW Asia. She has a decade of experience of working on issues of women's economic empowerment, leadership, masculinities, and health through a gender intersectional lens. She has experience of working on research projects with diverse stakeholders across India, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Over to you, Aniket.
Thank you, Pranita. Welcome once again, everyone, to this session. We are glad to have you here for this discussion. To begin with, I'll provide some brief background about this study and then take you through the rest of the details. We have looked at the 23 papers, reports, and articles for our literature review to basically synthesize evidence on what works when it comes to promoting men's role in caregiving in India. For the purpose of this particular study, we have defined caregiving to include activities that are such as cleaning, cooking, washing dishes, doing the laundry, assisting the elderly, assisting the ill, taking care of the child, so on and so forth. But through the course of this study, we also expanded it to include care for the self as well. Besides a literature review, we were also able to speak to 11 participants. These represented different organizations engaging men and boys, media organization, donor, and researcher. What we tried is to have some sort of diversity as much as possible across geography, age group of the program participants that these organizations engaged, the different sites of engagement where they engage. Those could be schools, communities, etc. And we tried to have the organizations which were exclusively focusing on care. But as we approached the organizations, as we looked at different kind of organizations in this space, we realized that most of them are having a focus on shifting overall gender norms with a sub topic of focusing on care. So yeah, and as for the limitation of this study, because this was a short study, and we found out that there was already existing limited literature. Uh, the study is also based on a lot of personal experience of the program people and the facilitators who are doing this work, and a lot more systematic study to see the kind of shifts that are actually happening on ground is needed. Moving on, uh, we would like to speak a little bit about the kind of programs that we have covered. So these programs are run both in schools as well as communities, and some of them are working exclusively in one of these or in both together as a strategy. It is very important for these programs to link some sort of livelihood or access to social protection so that the men and boys are interested in participating in such a program. In cases where the programs are engaging fathers, we saw that parent child relationship is a very key factor for the program. And like I said, except for the programs engaging fathers, where the focus was early child development, the other programs addressed multiple gender norms, which could include violence against women, rigid norms of masculinity, and also, as the focus of the study is, care work in the home. These programs were structured in a way that there was a fixed module that could be used as a guidance by the facilitator, and they had a clear session plan for each of the sessions and what kind of message they wanted to deliver in that session. The programs ranged from 6 months to about 2 years, and we had one exception where there was a program that was planned for 3 years, but the average length was actually 12 to 15 months. And almost all of these programs were activity based. There was something or the other that got the boys and men to do something during the sessions, talk to each other, to have some kind of physical based activity. And all of them almost also had a component where they had to go back to their homes, talk about something, do something with their peers or their family members, which also meant that they were able to reflect on these conversations after going back home as well. And most of the programs recognized and made sure that a multi stakeholder approach was also used so that apart from the men and boys they were engaging, they could also speak to other stakeholders to influence these men and boys. Talking about some effective strategies, organizations did realize that it was important to start with the issues that men and boys themselves face. Those could be their own vulnerabilities. And also at the same time, they recognized it was important to have a gender synchronous approach where the women and girls in the same community were engaged, whether it would be in the same program or as a supportive program as well. And when it comes to meeting men and boys, it was not just about their current issues, but also at times when they were available because of their engagement in livelihood or academics. It was important that the timings of the facilitators and the programs were adjusted in a way that they could meet and reach these men and boys. After that, they also realized that it was important to meet the needs of these men and boys, such as giving them access to jobs, those could be government schemes, etc. And they realized that the peer support or the influence of peers is also quite big and quite major in their lives. So they made sure to have peer support networks in which the conversations that the programs intend to have could be have had in these peer groups itself, which could enable sustainability of the changes that the programs aim. I already mentioned activity-based, I think, pedagogy, but one interesting, I think, approach that one of the organizations spoke to was during summers when they used to meet the participants. They used to bring fruits in the sessions, and what they used to do is ask the participants to showcase their skills of cutting these fruits, and it would invoke a discussion that would show that whoever is able to cut smooth and fast, they are the ones who are actually going home and doing these tasks actually. And those who couldn't are probably not taking up these tasks. So that was a way to start the conversations. And in these communities, it was also important to reward small bits and give encouragement to people who are showing some sort of small shifts in their behaviors. And of course, there was a need expressed by the participants in some way or the other to have segregated spaces as well, standalone spaces where only men and boys could speak about their issues. And the organizations realized that that alone is not that alone won't do to achieve gender equality, but there has to be some aspect where men and boys come together with girls and women as well. And of course, context really matters. Some sort of programs that are successful in urban areas might not be successful in rural areas. And at the same time, with the change in a state or region, the experiences of men and boys change as well. Lastly, in terms of being embedded in the community, wherever the organizations have been working in a particular community for longer or have aimed to do so, there they have seen a much better impact as opposed to where they are just recently getting started. And in terms of multi-stakeholder engagement, there are people in the community who hold power. There are different institutions in a community, such as schools, such as could be SHGs. So working with all of these multi-stakeholders together towards the goal of gender equality while working with men and boys did come up as a very important strategy as well. Coming to the shifts, the part that keeps all of us going on the field and encourages all of us to keep doing this work. Uh, there are three levels in which we saw these changes, the most common being in the self and the household. Men and boys did show some sort of self-awareness to begin with, where fathers would come and report that they after shouting at their child, they come to the facilitator and say, actually, I shouted on the child and I did not like it. I think I did something wrong. So the shift in realizing what norms of masculinity they have internalized themselves. After that, there have also been participants who have shared that they did start sweeping the floor, but behind closed doors. And because they were shy, they were wary of the resistance that could come up. But after slowly overcoming that inhibition, in fact, other fathers and men in the community also started doing the same after looking at the participant taking part in this unpaid care work activity. So there has also been some sort of ripple effect in terms of what kind of unpaid care work is taken up by different men, which of course, as I said, slowly increases, which also translates to understanding that women in their household also deserve economic opportunity, mobility, their own agency. And there is also a very interesting story where the men who have participated in this program was able to realize that his spouse does have the ability to sew well. So he bought his wife a sewing machine. So realizing that they also have their own agency and freedom was a kind of shift that was also seen. Programs where fathers were engaged towards early child development, there may or may not have been a shift in unpaid care work or in other aspects, but there was increased participation in spending time with the child, trying to play with them, trying to be present for them in different ways, so on and so forth. And lastly, in terms of community, while the shifts have been limited, we have seen participants have stood up to violence against women, where they have spoken against child marriage very specifically, where they have spoken against dowry. And like I already spoke, there has been some sort of ripple effect as well, where change shown by one father has also translated into other fathers being encouraged to similar change as well. To take it forward, I would like to invite Radhika to speak to other factors of this study.
Thank you, Aniket, and thanks, Pranita. So, just taking it forward from here, we have seen what are the kind of changes participants have undergone as they have participated in these programs. And we also saw Aniket take us through some of the strategies that have really worked across multiple programs. So, we actually looked at 14 different programs between looking at either their evaluation reports or speaking to the program teams. And through that is how we realize that some effective strategies really sort of stand out and help in creating more gender equitable households. But apart from that, we also found that there are certain enabling factors and they also sort of intersect. While here we have created different categories, we do realize that there is a clear interaction between each of them in creating an enabling ecosystem for the participant to be able to have certain behavioral change. So we saw that skilled facilitators is a great enabling factor. And when we say skilled facilitator, we don't just mean that having a technical know-how around gender, power, patriarchy, or talking about masculinity related norms, but actually having also skills of facilitation, skills of listening in, having empathy, creating a safe space where participants could really open up and talk about their own lived realities and their own insecurities also. So that really played a major role. The program team's own passion and interest and their own lived realities really played a main role as to why this change came in. I'm speaking on behalf of the team here. All the participants in the KIA that we've spoken to gave us so much of their time, and they spoke with so much passion that it really made us feel that that plays a major difference in driving a program forward. And that also sort of links us to the next point, that because they have this inherent passion, they are also able to build the relationships with the program participants. So we have quoted here that we heard the story about one program team member sharing with us that even if the participants has sort of completed the training course and has moved on, they still try and wish birthday wishes to them. They still try and connect them on festivals, just to keep the relationship going, just to also make sure in some ways that we are there for you. If you need support, we are there to fall back on, and you're not alone in this journey of change. And that plays a major role in also sustaining the changes, because these are short-term programs. As Aniket mentioned, the average length we saw was about 12 to 15 months. So sustaining the programs is very critical. Sustaining the change is very critical. So that is one way in which program teams have tried at their end to sustain the change. Role model effect really helped, as we saw the story of other fathers seeing, or other men seeing a man sort of do a sweeping work in the home, trying to also now feeling that it is normal to do that kind of work, has really helped. So different kinds of role models. Role models could be other men in the community. It could be the facilitators in the community also that have played a major role in sort of enabling this change. And long-term presence of these organizations, be it in the schools or be it within the community, has really helped in building the trust of the community in the facilitators, in what the mission and aim of the organization really is. So it really reduces the uncertainty or a lot of the questions that the community may have for the community members may have for the organization. So that has really also helped in bringing in this change. But we all know that there are also a lot of challenges in this work. As Pranita also mentioned in the beginning, this is very deep-rooted norms that we are trying to sort of challenge, and deep-rooted roles that we are trying to challenge here. So there are multiple challenges and barriers that also are faced in the process. First is that within the organizations, this is a newer space. So organizations also take a while to get more familiarized with the work around masculinity. And while skilled facilitators is a great enabler, finding the skilled facilitator has been a great challenge, because it is difficult to find male trainers who understand this work and want to sort of delve much deeper into this space. And a couple of organizations did mention to us that participants did not feel very comfortable in when they had a female facilitator. So therefore, having male facilitators, at least initially to begin with, where you want the participants to also sort of open up and share their perspectives and experiences, is very critical. And finding the male trainers was very difficult and challenging for organizations. Funding in this space is very limited. They are short term. It is also a very sort of stringent outcome metric that is associated with looking at changes, which also sort of restricts the work that partner programs are trying to do. And we all know behavioral change takes a lot of time. It's not something that can be achieved within a 1 year cycle. So in order to sustain the change, bring the change, and also just to have a more sustained engagement and conversations needs more time. So that did come across as one of the most critical challenge being faced by programs. Finding men at the time that they are available is also a main challenge that often comes up. And organizations have tried to sort of mitigate it by meeting men during Sundays or meeting them after their work hours or whatever time they are available. And they have also tried to use technology to reach to men if you're not able to meet with men in person or physically. So at least keep using WhatsApp chatbots or other kinds of AI tools to sort of stay connected with men and boys has also been a technology they've tried to use to mitigate the challenge. What we have also heard as a key barrier is the exposure to the manosphere. We know with the increase of digital technologies over the last couple of decades, and especially in the last decade or so, we have seen a lot more male influencer trying to put across a more misogynist, sexist narrative. Not all, I'm not generalizing here, but there is a prevalent manosphere that we are seeing in the digital spaces, and the exposure of the participants to that alongside this work is creating a sort of a dichotomy also often in the minds of the young men and boys, and that becomes a key critical sort of challenge that they are dealing with. At an institutional level, what we also see is that, especially this is something we are seeing at the level of schools, because often schools' primary focus is on academics. So while a space is being created to have a session on gender, it is often a one-off session on gender, and the requirement is to have more integrated session on gender across the different conversations that they have in school, and also how the school culture is, because oftentimes how we see with policies is a part of the pie, but the larger thing is also how the entire culture of the institution is and what does that reinforces. So that also does become a critical challenge. And lastly, the from where we started this conversation in the beginning, the gender norms are the biggest challenge that the partners are facing, where men see themselves primarily in the role of providers, and there is often a resistance when men try to challenge that role. The resistance comes from self, but the resistance also comes from the community, because the same norms are being reinforced within the communities, within their own families, within the peers as well. We've heard of cases where men have said that, oh, I was trying to do I was washing the clothes outside in my sort of public, in front of my house. And the other people around me started questioning me, why are you doing this work? This is not your work. Why is not your wife washing your clothes, etc.? So these kinds of narratives where even if somebody is trying to change, there is often resistance that comes up, and that becomes a key challenge for them to try and overcome. And what we also saw, while we saw manosphere coming up as a big challenge, we also wanted to highlight few glimmer of hope in the space of media, because we all realize that media in the different mediums it is, be it digital media spaces, be it television, advertisements, movies, all of them have a huge influence on the behavior, on everyone's behavior. And we are seeing that that is creating a big challenge for the work that the organizations are doing in the field. So in terms of me looking at media as a solution, we did find that there are a few sort of silver linings here and there we are able to find, where media is being used to provide an alternate narrative, to provide an alternate for question the existing roles and question the existing narratives of masculinity that is being propagated. And in that, we have found that there are also long form podcasts. And when we say long form, they are 40 minutes to an hour, which have actually gone viral in India. It has high reach, high engagement if we look at the traditional media metrics. And even when we try and look at what is the target, who are the viewers, viewership has both men and women. While very interestingly, if the viewership has both, the comments are largely by women. And we did try, and when we spoke to some participants and as part of our study, they also shared with us how women are trying to bring in more men to watch these kinds of shows and these kinds of podcasts and hear about alternate stories. And what really helped is that the content has to be very relatable. It should come from somebody who men look up to, which could be sports icon, film stars, which could be comedians, etc. And also it needs to be more and now as we see, it also has to be delivered in a language that men can relate to. It should not become very preachy. So it is also important that it is relatable. It is something close to what they can understand. And when that happens, we have also heard stories of men actually watching these shows and coming up to the presenters when they meet the presenters in any public space and opening up and sharing that your show hit me at a time when I was feeling very low. I felt that I have someone and somebody can understand the emotions I'm going through, or it ignited a spark in me to look at things in a different light. So there is hope in trying to use media, and there was constantly also a recommendation that media needs to be used and leveraged to promote an alternate form of alternate narrative than what we are already seeing. However, we also do realize, and these challenges came up quite often, that CSO funding is very, very limited. In that space, it becomes extremely difficult to sort of compete with the larger masculine narratives that we are seeing in the manosphere space. The other was that care is making care more mainstream, or conversations around care more mainstream means making care look cool. And we are quoting it as it is because this is how we also got this, that it is important to make it cool if you want others to sort of relate to that, and especially the newer generation to relate to this. So how do you really make it cool while also making it financially rewarding, because it is a profitable business, is sort of a key unanswered question that even we have, and we were trying to delve more deeper into this. And television, while there are some narratives that are coming in at the level of digital media, television still has a much higher reach, especially in a context like India. And TV shows have a higher recall also. So in that, how can we leverage television and try and use that as a medium is also a critical challenge that we see, that as a sector we may need to sort of deliberate a little bit more of how do we look at changing the narrative that is being propagated through television, which has a higher reach also. Now, just to sort of sum up what we sum up from what we have heard so far, we saw that there are definitely models that have been successful in engaging with men and in trying to have a behavioral change component in them, where we see men participating more in caregiving and trying to create more gender equitable households. And in order to do so, there are certain things or certain sort of um certain points that we feel have are very key takeaways from this entire study. And the first one is that in order to make this change, it is very important to meet where the men are. And when we say this, we mean both literally and figuratively. It is important to meet men at a time when they are available, but also meet them at their vulnerabilities, where their practical entry points are, and from there engage them into a journey of self-reflection. Second is, it is also very critical for these programs to be rooted within the communities, because how we say women's lives are not in isolation, men's lives are also not in isolation. So it is important to work with the ecosystem actors, so the same gender norms are not being reinforced by the other players in their community. And therefore, that multi-stakeholder approach of working with families, working with the communities and other key power holders becomes very critical. Norm change often begins with self-reflection. We have seen that through these pedagogies of creating safer spaces, being more action-oriented, it ignites a bit of internal churning. And therefore, through that churning of an introspection of their own emotions, their own change that they feel is needed, is how sort of the change process starts. So it needs to start from self, and only then it can lead to other kinds of changes. And in the norm change process, the role of the peer becomes very critical. And that's what we have seen, that most programs that we studied and the people we have spoken to, they have often told us that they have created this group, these collectives in the communities, because that peer solidarity and having somebody in the community who has your back becomes very important, and that supports the norm change process. Then small invisible behavioral shifts definitely precede the larger changes. As Aniket also said, the initial changes we see is in the self at the level of their own awareness, their own understanding of their own emotions, as well as the emotions of their children or the women in their lives. And that's how we see larger shifts of happening at the household level or even at the level of the community. The barriers that we have seen are more structural, be it related to gender norms, be it related to the backlash that comes from the community, be it related to also the lack of long term funding for this kind of work. So these are a lot more structural barriers that are emerging. Media is an underutilized space but has a high leverage. It did come across as a key influencer in the entire space, and we strongly feel that that's a stakeholder we need to find ways to engage with and leverage. And there are also some unanswered questions that we have. There are questions of how do you make this work more sustainable, especially in the this kind of funding cycles. Behavioral change also takes a lot of time. So then, how do we look at sustainability of this change? The other question with sustainability often comes is that, especially in the Indian context, young men often migrate for work and for better work opportunities. So whether that work, whether how do we ensure that the change sustains when the context changes? So that is a critical question that needs further exploration. The other critical question also is that while we are seeing changes at the level of the individual's awareness, action, what is the linkage of these shifts in when we look at its relationship with the broader gender equality goals? So that linkage needs to also sort of be further examined. However, and I'll just close with this last line. I know I have taken more time, but we just want to end on a positive note because we felt that the study did really inspire us, reinforced our commitment towards this work. We heard some great stories of change that we have tried to highlight, and this is a preliminary analysis. We are in the process of doing a deeper analysis, and we will be coming up with an evidence brief on based on the study by end of April, which we'll also publish externally. But we just wanted to say that this has reinforced our commitment to continue working on this pathway and to continue reimagine different pathways to create gender equitable care systems. And with that, I would like to hand it over back to Pranita. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Radhika and Aniket, for such a rich presentation. And we are going to have more conversation around this and other work and experiences. And I see there are some comments and reflections are getting added. There are questions. Please continue to do that, and we'll try to respond to questions as much we can. But we would also love to hear your comments and any reflection, any work you may have done in your own context. It will be really nice to also learn from those. Moving forward, we have two esteemed panelists with us, Lakshman and Devyani. I'll just give a brief introduction of them. Many of you maybe like know them pretty well, but just as a responsibility, let me do that. So Lakshman is co-director of Men Engage Alliance. Lakshman is originally from Nepal and has over 20 years of experience in strategic planning programs, monitoring, evaluation, learning, and advocacy for women's rights, working with men and boys in gender justice and child rights. Lakshman has worked and provided technical support to various NGOs, UN agencies, and governments across multiple regions. Devyani has been leading the research, monitoring, and evaluation practice at Probex Consulting since 2010. Gender equality programming and especially programs that work with men and boys are areas of interest and focus for her. Devyani has conducted several studies on parenting and masculinities and developed theory of change, evaluated portfolio of work for many organizations. I'm so glad that Lakshman and Devyani could join us for this conversation. Thank you both of you to be here. So I'll just start this question for Lakshman from you. Um, Lakshman, you have been in this space for and have been working in this space for couple of decades, um, across different contexts, country context. So could you please share your key reflections on the study findings? Anything that stood out for you or resonated the most, or something you felt is not really emerging, something which may be surprising? Would love to hear your thoughts. Over to you, Lakshman.
Yeah, thank you, Pranita, and thank you, ICRW team, for inviting me for these reflections, and Radhika and Aniket for presenting. I think, yeah, this is an area where, we have been having a lot of debates about what really, when we look at, we have been using different terms, and Ravi knows this as well, right? We men and caregiving, or men and caregivers, or caregiving, or parenting, or sort of economies of care, which is more towards the very intersectional feminist analysis of care as an agenda, right? But I think, one of the things that I really was really coming through, which I really admire, is that there are a couple of things. One is that there is sort of willingness among men to change in terms of take on more responsibilities when it comes to care work, when it comes to sharing the responsibilities of the paid, on particularly unpaid care work at homes level. And I think it's very interesting and typical of South Asian context, where we see men, doing things when in the closed door, inside home, but then one want to talk about it, or don't want to even say that they're doing this work. And at one point there was, some conversations about when men, particularly young men from South Asian context, would move to a Western country, they would do all the care work very openly, heavily, and even, much more than what one could expect. And then when they go back home, they don't do at all. So what is that dynamic really? What that tells us is basically is that men and boys do have interest and capacity to do that. It's just that it becomes a certain kind of an power dynamic or gender dynamic, which is coming out from your study as well, right? It's kind of very interesting to see, and also very important to assert that it is not about capacity issue. It's about the norms. It's about power. It's about the structure that we have in our systems, right? So sometimes, we hear our mothers saying, "Oh, you don't know how to cook," right? But I think, it's not about whether or not. The other is also the fact that I think what we have seen in India as well as in South Asian context, right, particularly around cooking and the conversation of paid and unpaid care. So if the same work is paid as a professional work, men do dominate those areas, while the same men may not do the work at home. So we also need to sort of analyze that in a very specific way, where we need to understand and unpack and connect that with more of the economies of care, where the unpaid care work needs to be, the 3 R's, right? We really need to work also not about devaluing the unpaid work that women have been taking heavy load of so far, but how can that be, brought into the limelight of economic paradigm? And at one point, we used to discuss about whether the unpaid care work, or both in at the household or informal systems, should be part of the national GDP analysis, right? How can that advocacy be done? And I think that's something to really look at. One thing that I was also reflecting on when you were presenting was always, sort of the entry point would be about men's interest or men's vulnerability. However, that has become a little tricky in many programs as well. Sometimes that have tend to get stuck to this men's vulnerability, whereby then it becomes the hierarchy of vulnerability, right? So we need to look at that from a very relational and then structural perspective as well, right? There will be differences between how one experiences at the relational level versus how that shows up at power and structural level. So those both need to be very well tied up in the way we have these conversations or work with boys and men. Also to sort of, I know this, all of you must have heard this, as heard this many times, but the work with men and boys is not the end goal. So that needs to be very, very clear from the beginning. Work with boys and men is a strategy out of many to then focus on transforming unequal power relations and inequalities. So I think that is where then when we look at the care and economies of care and the work with men, we do need to address and sort of transform the notions about masculinities that become the roots and barriers of men taking on appropriate role, but also at the systems level of patriarchy, where any work that women and girls are taking or doing the most are the ones that are most devalued in economic terms, right? Which is in a capitalist paradigm. But at the same time, care, Aniket knows this, and we have written an article called Care is not the goal, but it's a pathway as well. So when we look at working with men, we also need to look at care. However, I was kind of interesting also it will be lovely to have more conversation. That when we talk about care, it's not about self-care we are only talking about, right? In a context like India or South Asia, the concept of self-care cannot be understood as it is understood generally in a very nuclear family setup in the Western context. Our care cannot be self-care all the time. It has to be collective care. And hence that needs to be very, very, very critical in the work that we are doing with boys and men, because boys are socialized to be very this individualistic, right? In terms of in how they are, who they are in terms of identity, and we need to deconstruct that notion of, oh, men need to care for themselves too, making it much more broader about, yes, men's needs have been always at the center because of patriarchy and hence have been cared for many years, or heavily being cared for, right? In terms of looking at. But I think that also needs to be a little more unpacked as well. And I agree, one of the lessons is that these interventions are very short term, and that kind of transformation we are looking at from sometimes, if you look at the socio-ecological framework, even though it's a health framework, it does help in terms of the transformation we talk about. Not only look at, for 12 and 15 months, I think we need to be realistic as well. That might bring just the tip of the iceberg on the kind of transformation we are looking at. And it requires long-term funding in order to sustain that change and bring about the sustainable and lasting kind of transformation we are looking at, which is very, very important. And that also helps me to, and one thing I always comes to mind is that a major role, and we talk about role models, we talk about men only facilitating, and that's where, men tend to open more. Ultimately, one thing we are learning from the field of men and masculinities is when we identify facilitators, we need to invest on making those facilitators believe on what they are saying and what they need to be saying as well. Sometimes it becomes very performative role as facilitators, and when they run sessions, they say something, but outside of the sessions, they exactly do the opposite of what they just said. So how do we make sure that those consistency, because a lot of connections and transformatory change among boys and young men we see not happening in the sessions, actually outside of the sessions, where there are informal chats happening, where jokes happen. And when there it is not intervened, then it becomes really, really challenging. So having investing on great facilitator, and sometimes it is helpful to have mixed gender facilitators as well. In the beginning, I think we haven't realized that in the beginning to start the conversation, probably yes. But I think down the line, it is always recommended now to make it as not to only that also to also counter this men as experts only narrative, right? And that undermines women's expertise at the same time. And then these men only tend to listen to what men say, but not really listen to the experts and women leaders as well. So we need to start looking at as that as well. Um, Yeah, and then also looking at and connecting this with not only the individual behavior change paradigm, but how do we connect that with the structural and institutional or policy level change, right? For example, in the work of fatherhood, one of the things that we have been discussing about when it comes to advocacy is the paternity leave conversation. But in a context like India and Nepal, where I am from, only talking about paternity leave doesn't help in transforming the care systems or care industry or care institution or framework. We have to talk about parental leave in a context where even mothers don't have enough parental leave. And what does it mean then for us to be advocating for fathers having leave? So I think we need to have a balanced approach so that there is a complementarity to what feminist movement have been trying to do for so long, but also with add value and amplify and act accountably to the overall agenda, which is the gender justice and equality agenda. So I think that is somewhere, and then all of this also needs to be looked at also. One thing we have talked about in the field of boys and men is fatherhood, for example, has been a very appealing entry point. But I think when you look at economies of care paradigm and what feminist movement have been doing, fatherhood is a good entry point, but it cannot just stay and stick to the issue of fatherhood. It needs to be then moved on to, which I'm seeing that your programs are finding. It has led to some kind of a very other, and at the same time, I keep on saying that in a context like ours, bringing men into the kitchen is one task, but that is not the end. That should also look at bringing women out of the kitchen so that men get into the kitchen, women get into the politics, for example, or women get to occupy the public space. So I think we need to look at the full cycle of what the transformative agenda should look like. And because we have seen a lot of fatherhood related programs saying, oh, father need to care 50% of child care and take household help. But then we are not saying the fathers need to then also be creating an encouraging environment for women in the family to go out in public, take the so-called masculine spaces as well, as much as they are occupying this space. So I think how does that transformation happen? And then that also requires a long-term investment in the work we are doing um, as well. And then also to uh, yeah, and
Yeah.
then last point is when we bring this argument from economic productivity and so on, there can be a bit of a challenge in the sense that what care with the care work, what we are also we are discussing, we haven't started doing it, we are still unpacking what that means, is to use care agenda as a means of challenging neoliberal capitalist system as well. So if we come with this very argument of economic productivity, then I think somewhere we might be careful about feeding into the neoliberal economic system or capitalist system, but rather use that as a way to also talk about degrowth and then bring in the care as not only a human-centered agenda, but associated with planet, taking care of the planet as well, right? So that it doesn't become individual, but broader than that. So I'll stop there, and I hope that
Thank,
was
yeah.
helpful.
Thank you, Lakshman. And with all your reflection, you also provided a lot of very critical recommendations. So thank you for doing that. Now I'll invite Devyani. Devyani, you have been a researcher and evaluator with extensive experience. You have looked at the implementation and impact of male engagement programs. So, would love to hear your thoughts and reflections on the study that Aniket and Radhika have shared. Anything again stood out for you? Anything you felt is not there? And maybe just in the interest of time, also please add a specific recommendation you may have as to how should we really move forward, especially within the space of evidence building. But you don't have to restrict yourself around that. Feel free to also elaborate on other aspects. Over to you, Devyani.
Thanks so much, Panita, and to the whole ICRW team for conducting and sharing the findings from this important study. I would just like to pick up on, one of the points that Lakshman made, which is really about the fact that there is willingness among men to be involved in care work, right? And that's something that we've seen as well. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about some of our observations about motivators that we've seen. And we had a very interesting experience where we were working for, for multiple years on an evaluation of a program that engages adolescent boys in looking at how do you transform gender norms with a large focus on unpaid care work. And we started out sort of looking at, do boys recognize that the distribution of unpaid care work is unfair, right? And our assumption was that when they realize it's unfair, that sense of fairness and that sense of justice will lead them to want to kind of change that. And it seemed like a logical assumption. But as we got into the evaluation, what we realized is that boys often felt that it is fair, right? Because the men are working outside the home and the women are working in the home. So it's, separate but equal, it's fair. And so we were, talking to the organization and we decided like, okay, let's try to shift this and look at, do adolescent boys recognize unpaid care work as work, right? I mean, do they recognize it as something that requires skill? Do they recognize it as something that helps them gain skills? And I think that sort of opened up a whole nother kind of sphere, right? Because I think otherwise you get into this whole thing of, oh, like what should men be doing and what should women be doing versus, how can we all kind of excel at doing the things that need to be done and how can we sort of explore interests and not worry about what gender norms are telling us. So I thought that is kind of one interesting observation we had when we were talking about motivators. I think also I wanted to talk a bit about barriers, especially this barrier of, the men being the providers. And I think, especially in India, we see that this norm is very, very sticky, right? It seems to be one of the hardest norms to change. And what I wanted to bring in here is also the role of the work context itself, right? Because in some of our research, what we found is that actually in rural settings, where the work environment and the home environment might be closer together, let's say in an agricultural kind of household, or where there is seasonality, right? And that you may have off seasons where there's a lot more leisure time in general. That kind of opens up some more spaces for greater equality in caregiving. Whereas in an urban environment, where especially in a lot of low income households, a lot of men are engaged in gig work, it's a very different situation, right? Because you have long hours, you're away from home. If you're a driver, you're on the road all the time. And so I think we have to look at the work context. And that feeds into one of my recommendations, which is that we have to be working with employers also, right? And certainly, parental leave is one area to look at, but other ways of looking at flexible time, right? I mean, so why do we often only talk about flexi time for mothers, right? I mean, why can we not look at that for fathers as well? So I think one of my recommendations is that we have to sort of work with employers and to understand what it means in different work contexts for men to be more involved in caregiving. I think from an evidence perspective, right, I do want to bring up one recommendation, which is that I think we need to be more curious about how much participation in care work is happening and who is doing it, right? So often we see that, it kind of becomes this like yes or no, like, yes, men in our program are now participating in care work, right? But is it meaningful participation, right? What does that actually mean? I think we need to dig into that a lot deeper. And I also think we need to look at it in different kinds of household contexts and with different demographic groups. So an adolescent boy participating in his parents' household in care work is going to look very different from a married man participating in the household that he and his wife live in care work. And the expectations will be different. And And so I think unpacking that a bit more and understanding those nuances, I think, is very important. And I think related to that, I think that we must look at, I mean, of course, the ecosystem approach has been mentioned, and we know that. So, yes, we work with adolescent boys because we think it's important to change gender norms early. But are we working with their fathers, right? I mean, they may be much harder to work with, but ultimately, those are their role models and those are the people they're seeing. Um, and I think also, when are we working with people, right? Are we working with them at stages in their life cycle when there may be greater receptivity to change? Are we working with young men just before or just after they get married, right? Are we working with first time fathers? And I think that's also part of this meeting men where they are, right? It's also meeting them where they are in the life cycle that I think is important to look at. I think the point of working with men and women, so we're looking at caregiving and livelihoods and economic opportunity for women is really important. It's also been mentioned. And I think that the last thing I want to talk about is this aspect of how do you sustain these changes beyond the program, right? And I think we must look at investing in those structures, right? So we spoke about sort of men's collectives. I think that it's really great that that's come up. I think for a long time there was a belief that, oh, men will not participate in collectives, but we are seeing otherwise. And I think, really investing in that community around these men so that those changes are supported, so that they're sustained, is a really important piece of this work. And so, yeah, those are some of the recommendations that I wanted to share.
Thank you, Devyani. These are really very nice, interesting, and insightful. I think that there's a lot to discuss and unpack. Actually, the point that you mentioned about meaningful engagement, what that really means, and also some of the points what Lakshman mentioned. So I think we understand some part, but I think we need to understand and unpack much more. And also some of the caveats, some of the flags, what Lakshman mentioned, we must really keep in mind. Just in the interest of time, I really wanted to go another round of discussion, but I would really invite Ravi to give his closing remarks. Just quickly, Ravi is Executive Director of ICRW Asia and a social scientist with over 3 decades of experience advancing gender equality. His work has focused extensively on engaging men and boys, addressing harmful masculinity norms, and promoting more equitable gender relations. I mean, there are many more, but I'll just invite Ravi to share some of his thoughts and also do a closing of the event.
Well,
And I'm sure that we'll have much more discussion. And we are not going to, we had not started with this event, we are not going to stop with this event. So over to you, Ravi.
no, thank you so much. Thanks a lot. I think we are already over time. There's no time for me to give any more reflections. I was just admiring the comments from Lakshman and Devyani for being so thoughtful, and I think everything that had to be said has been said here. So I will not repeat any one of that. All I just wanted to say that both from this study and also from a lot of work that we have been doing in Manthan and Umang within different communities, it seems there's a need for more investment into this kind of work, which is what Devyani was alluding to. The fact which also was brought in by Lakshman, that there is a silent, I would say, majority of men who are willing to challenge and change, and they are at the cusp of questioning and trying to understand how do we push the pushbacks, and I think that's where the idea of dismantling our own assumptions, how we engage with them, and also have faith in the change process, which are happening in smaller ways but significant ways, in ways that are relational in nature and are pointing at the structural factors rather than individual changes is such critical insights that we get from all these comments and the studies, and we have to really hang on to that and take that further. I also think that there is a need to learn from these studies as to what are the new hypotheses are emerging, because I think these are not really well researched and documented work, but so good to see so many work happening. And there's so much of different ways that they are engaging. Entry points are different. Where are men at their life stages that we are intervening with, and what are the kind of learning they are generating. So I think there's a need to, again, going back to investing into this kind of collectivized work that's happening around, to distill out the nuanced, layered understanding of how changes are happening. And with that note, I thank you again, Devyani, for reiterating that point, Lakshman for raising hopes and optimism, and Pranita and Radhika and Aniket for bringing together these diverse set of experience together. That shows that we need to work on not only documenting but also narrative shifts, which is such an important point that both Radhika and Aniket so emphatically brought out, that we need to shift the narratives. And I think we are constantly caught up within our own assumptions, which really takes either one side or the other. I think there's a need for balance, that Lakshman was saying, and that is something that the narrative building we have to do. So thank you so much, and I thank all the. Let me just make sure that I do justice to my thank giving. So yes, so that is Devyani and Lakshman. Thank you, love you for your comments, for being engaged with us in this process. Thanks, Radhika, Aniket, and Pranita for doing this, and NGO CSW team for giving us this opportunity to share these reflections. And as Pranita says, this is just this. Every time we discuss these things, we always say this is starting point and not the end point. But I think this journey is always, wherever you start with jab bhi उठ जाओ तभी सवेरा है. I think we say whenever you wake up, that's the morning. So I think this is the time to continue this journey. Thank you very much. Thank you all participants for being so inquisitive, for asking questions, for putting your comments on the, and I have noted, we would like to reach out to some of the participants from the different organizations to learn from them firsthand, and make sure that we learn collectively, we do this journey together. So thank you for being fellow travelers. Thank you so much. And thanks to all the donors who have been supporting us for this particular work. And I hope that they will remain invested into this. Thank you.
Thank you everyone. And we'll also respond to some of the questions that were mentioned, and we'll share those back to you all on your registered email ID. Thank you everyone. Have a nice day, nice evening.